Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate Center, and it is my pleasure, as always, to welcome you to another Gotham Center event. If you're not familiar with the Gotham Center, I invite you to go to gothamcenter.org, where you'll find over 1,000 articles, book reviews, event recordings, podcasts, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. So tonight, as part of our regular interview series, we'll be discussing Exiles in New York City, warehousing the marginalized on Randall's Island, apologies, Ward's Island, this new book from CUNY's Philip T. Yanos and Columbia University Press. In the age of trains, planes, and automobiles, you can be forgiven for not realizing that New York City is an archipelago, a set of about 40 islands, large and small. Staten Island may be the forgotten borough, but the smaller islands around New York are practically unknown. Ward Island is no small island, and lying in the East River, it sits just a short distance from Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx, yet it is virtually cordoned off from the city, as our author states. For most of its history, it's been a dumping ground for New York City's marginalized, in particular these days, the unhoused and mentally ill. Its psychiatric hospitals, homeless shelters, and substance abuse program hold about 1,300 people, with another 2,000 refugees from around the world sitting in a detention center for asylum seekers. You'd hardly know that fact, since all those institutions stand behind tall fences overshadowed by the expansive, friendly athletic fields and green space of Randall's Island, which now unites the two. Ward's Island is not unique for this history. Nearly all the islands around New York were used to quarantine or detain or imprison over the last few hundred years. But as our guest tonight is ideally placed to say, what this invisibility has meant for the people whose lives are often contained in these facilities is something very dire. Philip T. Yanos is professor of psychology at John Jay College within the CUNY system. He is the author of Written Off, Mental Health, Stigma, and the Loss of Human Potential, as well as over 130 peer-reviewed publications. He has been awarded the John Jay College Scholarly Excellence Award 5 times in the last 10 years or so. But most importantly for tonight's conversation, he grew up on Ward's Island himself, where his father worked as a psychiatrist for the Manhattan State Hospital. So this book is part history and part social critique, ending with a vision for what the island might become. I'm extremely pleased to welcome our guest. As usual, we have disabled the chat and hand-raising functions in Zoom out of respect to our speaker. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen at any point in the next hour. We'll begin with an overview of the book by Professor Yanos, followed by some Q&A from me and you yourself. So with that, I hope you will join us in welcoming our guests with the usual bit of silent applause.
Thanks so much, Peter. Appreciate having the opportunity to talk about the book here and get input from folks who are interested in New York City history and all things New York. So I'm going to share my screen and do a presentation, and then I'll be happy to hear questions. So let's do that, and you should be seeing my slideshow now. So so this is the cover of the book. It was published on April 15th, so it's pretty new. A little bit about me. I know some of this was mentioned, but I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I do work still with people with serious mental illnesses. I work on something called an assertive community treatment team in the East Harlem neighborhood in Manhattan. As a researcher, my main focus is on stigma toward people with mental illnesses, and so that's definitely informed this book. I'm a professor at John Jay in the Graduate Center. I teach doctoral and master's and undergraduate classes, and I'm a native and lifelong New Yorker, and that, of course, is informed my interest in this topic. So I just want to acknowledge my family's support of this, especially my family of origin. We grew up together or lived together on Ward's Island, Columbia University Press, and a lot of students who've really helped a lot, especially Shariar Hussein and Melissa Martinez, two students who really helped me a lot with this project. A number of other students participated in some of the research that we did. And then many of these library institutions that really have a treasure trove of information out there, especially New York Public Library and New York City Municipal Archives. Okay, so a lot of people first ask, where is Ward's Island? So just showing you some different perspectives here. This is from ArcGIS, so a map of it. This is a Google, um, overhead view, and this is just a drone shot, I guess. So it's attached to Randall's Island here by landfill. It was a separate island, and it's located at this nexus between Manhattan, uh, Queens, and the Bronx. There's a lot of natural beauty there. These are some photos I took just from the waterfront. It can really bring you a lot of calm and peace to be there. There's also a rail overpass that was built in the early 1910s, um, and a wastewater treatment facility is there as well. That was also built in the early part of the 20th century, still there. And it has several institutions that house people. And so this is a list of the institutions there. Manhattan Psychiatric Center. We'll learn about the history of how it got there. Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Center, sort of related. These two homeless shelters, the Keener Shelter and the Clark Thomas Men's Shelter. The Odyssey House Residential Substance Treatment Center. Uh, two community residences, so transitional living residents, and the Jewish Board community residents. And so the shelter for asylum seekers closed just a couple months ago, and that housed about 2,000 people recently. This is a list of the amenities on the island. It's a pretty easy list to go over. There are no grocery stores, or no restaurants, or no houses of worship, and no libraries. It has one public bus that terminates at 125th Street and Lexington Avenue. You can see there the M35 bus. It says Randall's Island, Ward's Island. So that's the only way on and off the island, unless you want to walk. So the island has an earlier history, of course, that goes back to indigenous people and the early settlers. But really, in terms of what we're interested in here, its origin story goes back to 1847. So in May of 1847, the city was preparing to open a center for sick and destitute immigrants in Astoria, which was then a town in Long Island. And shortly after it planned to open this, we're told that inhabitants incensed at the project assembled in disguise and destroyed the premises on the following evening. So this is from a book called New York and Its Institutions that was published in the 1800s. And so pretty soon after this, the city began purchasing land on Ward's Island from the private landholders. It was named after the brothers Jasper and Bartholomew Ward, so it was named after merchants. At the time, it was reachable only by ferry. So this created a buffer that would perhaps protect against this community opposition that manifested itself in Astoria. And the Immigrant Refuge and Hospital opened rapidly thereafter in 1848, and it housed roughly 2,000 recently arrived immigrants from Germany and Ireland. The next institution to open was the Inebriate Asylum, which opened 20 years later, and this was for people experiencing alcohol problems. So here's a lithograph, I guess, of the Immigrant Refuge and Hospital on the island. You can see that it was quite pastoral, and looks like a pleasant place, but accounts of it is that it was quite rough, very carceral in nature. Here's a late 1860s map that includes Ward's Island, and so you can see. I know that it might be hard to see, but this is the Immigrant Refuge and Hospital here, facing Manhattan, and the Inebriate Asylum was facing the Queens side. So the next major institution to open was the New York City Asylum for the Insane. which opened in 1871. And this was the second branch of the New York City Asylum for the Insane in New York City. The first opened on Blackwell's Island, which is now Roosevelt Island. Excellent book about that, um, uh, called Damnation Island by Stacey Horn. Um, and so basically it was getting overcrowded. And so the Ward's Island branch was open to house men to ease that overcrowding. Eventually, it came to house male and female patients when the Blackwell Island Asylum was closed following the 10 Days at the Madhouse scandal. And most people are probably familiar with that. Population of the asylum grew very rapidly from about 500, kept growing every year, reached a high water mark of about 8,000 by 1930. No indication that it was going to slow down until new events kind of interceded. Throughout its early history, I read all of the annual reports that were written, and it was consistently being described as being underfunded, overcrowded, understaffed, and having poor conditions. So Alexander McDonald, who was the first long-term superintendent, stated clearly, there is not a town or village upon this continent that spends as little upon its insane as this great city of New York. And this extended description from Heard et al.'s mental institutions in the United States said that the new Wards On building was faulty and inconvenient, lighting and heating were inadequate, the attendants were too few, the food and clothing not much more than sufficient to keep soul and body together. The furniture was the rudest, benches without backs, steel tables that never saw cloth, etc. And there were lots of newspaper accounts of unsanitary conditions that were very critical of this. From the beginning, this was a home to the city's poor, who were predominantly immigrants. So in the annual reports, it listed country of origin for the patients, and year after year, over 50% were foreign-born, recent immigrants. Something that was a lot harder to track was the number of Black patients. So we know there was segregation in a lot of the asylums in those days. It's clear that it was not segregated, because there are accounts of quote unquote Negro and colored patients, but there's no reporting of the number. I do feel confident saying that there is evidence that they were not segregated, based on this article here that I have the headline for, which reported that tragic situation where a Black person appears to have killed a attendant, but it states clearly that a German person lived in the bed next to him. Peter, do you have a question?
No, I'm not sure why that happened.
Okay,
I'm
all right,
gonna
no
some more
problem.
palette work.
Okay,
Go
I
on.
will continue on. Okay. Um, Moving ahead, it's hard to tell any New York story without including Robert Moses, and Robert Moses became a big part of this story. So, as I mentioned, it was detached from the mainland. You can only get there by ferry. Um, Moses and others in the urban planning area saw this as an opportunity to bring more park space to the city. So he stated there's a deplorable shortage of space for active play in the upper part of Manhattan Island and the lower part of the Bronx. Development of play facilities will solve this problem. It can be solved in no other way. His vision was of destruction, of leveling of all of the um, institutions, and bringing, complete conversion to parkland. And so he influenced this laws of 1933 that discussed that there would be a removal of the inmates of Manhattan State Hospital. Such property and equipment used or in connection with the hospital would be raised, and that people would be moved to Pilgrim State Hospital, which is all the way out in Suffolk County. These are some of the plans that were circulated around this time. So the one on the left was to kind of show the size of Ward's Island and kind of how much parkland would be benefited, would be gained from it. And on the right is Moses's actual plan for the development of Ward's Island. His development also included the construction of the Triborough Bridge, so that connected Ward's Island to the mainland, as well as the construction of a footbridge from 103rd Street in East Harlem. And so that also allowed people in East Harlem to potentially walk over to access the park facilities. A public bus was started in 1937, and this is one of those things that, as somebody who grew up on the island and took this bus a lot, kind of found hilarious because it basically describes something that has not changed, in 80 years. So a public bus service has been established, which affords the opportunity through a 5-cent fare for visitors and employees to leave Lexington Avenue, 125th Street, and reach the hospital via Randall's Island at maximum intervals of 1/2 hour. It has been reasonably satisfactory. So the frequency and the terminus hasn't changed. The fare has gone up, but other than that, it's pretty much the same. So the hospital was saved. It was not destroyed as Moses planned for it to be. Number of different things came into the picture. World War II was a big part of it. And so instead of destroying the hospital, they got new facilities, which was great because the old facilities were really decaying, were a fire hazard. There were a number of scary incidents that occurred. And so these buildings that still stand today were opened in the very late 1950s. There was a lot of enthusiasm for community reentry in the 60s. Chlorpromazine, the sort of first antipsychotic medication, was developed in France, came to the United States. This really impacted what could be done. There was also just kind of the general mood of the time was very, um, progressive. So this is an article that describes one of the open wards on the island, talks about the desire for freedom sweeping the world in the mid 1960s and how they incorporated open wards where people could go out into the New York community and return. In the late 1960s and 1970s, things really seemed to be taking a downturn. Evidence from the record indicates that the parkland was ignored. This is from a New York Times article that talked about that. New institutions started to open up. So Odyssey House and Manhattan's Children's Psychiatric Center opened up. And the island acquired a bad reputation. So both of these photos are from the French Connection movie, which had its culminating scenes filmed on the island. So this is where Gene Hackman as Popeye Doyle is walking onto the island from Randall's. This is a shootout scene that occurs at the end. This is an article that talks about a pervasive fear within Manhattan State Hospital. And I just want to note that the fear was not of patients, it was of community members who were, according to the article, entering the hospital with copies of keys, and they were coming and preying upon patients. My family lived on Ward's Island from 1970 to 1980 in a house called Cottage 4. So here you see a picture of me, my brother, and my dad standing in front of Cottage 4. Here we all are in our yard. This was my stepmother who just arrived from Greece. This is her first real winter. It was a memorable one in the early 70s. So we lived there. We had a very pleasant time. We didn't experience it as this place that was sort of pictured in these articles or in the French Connection. So it was a different kind of experience for us. My father was a staff psychiatrist, and he's pictured here with the staff from Manhattan State Hospital in the late 70s, so I just circled him there. It's described as a largely foreign-born staff. My father was born in the United States, but he grew up in Greece, so he's kind of fit in with the other psychiatrists there who were largely international in origin. Things really changed in 1980. The increase in street homelessness was being noted in New York City. I talk about that a good bit in the book. And because of this move toward finding the island as a place to avoid community opposition, it was identified as a location to open really the first major shelter outside of the Bowery. And so this is a photo of Ed Koch visiting the shelter in the Keener building, which is still there to this day. And my former mentor, Kim Hopper's book, Reckoning with Homelessness, talks a lot about this, and I definitely recommend it to you if you're interested in getting into that story a little further. Part of the story here was the Callahan Consent Decree, which came out of a lawsuit from the Legal Aid Society, but became the Coalition for the Homeless. And it established the right to shelter that we still have to this day in New York City. And the Keener building was specifically named in the consent decree. And I just want to establish that, it set up very minimal standards for what someone would get in a shelter, which was a narrow bed, more like a cot, and access to certain sheets and things like that. But there's not a lot that this offered. And this is a photo of the inside of a shelter from recent years. In 1990, there was this horrific hate crime against shelter residents that was committed by youths from East Harlem who came over the footbridge. One person was killed, several other people were injured. Apparently, this followed a history of hostility between the community and the shelter residents. And the city's response to it was to raise the footbridge, make it so that people couldn't get there any longer, instead of kind of offering more, um, you know, support or policing of the shelter. And by surprise, things started to change toward bringing back the parkland aspect in the early 1990s with the establishment of the Randall's Island Sports Foundation, and later became known as the Randall's Island Park Alliance. And so the story of this group is that it was led by a group of wealthy citizens, and they envisioned a public-private partnership to improve the quality of park and sports facilities on Randall's and Ward's Island. They chose to name it after Randall's Island. And they did succeed in using these funds to renovate sports fields and beautify the waterfront. But they also succeeded in getting high fencing placed around the institutions. And some of their comments indicated that they felt that they didn't want the institutions to be there. They didn't like the presence of the residents of them. And so, in one of its directors talked about, it being like Night of the Living Dead, and using that kind of denigration of the residents. They've also promoted the use of the Reynolds Island name and kind of sort of moved away from using the Ward's Island name. The name Ward's Island appears to be gradually disappearing from maps. So these are comparisons of the Department of Transportation's bike map, which you could see year after year. And so it was named Ward's Island and Ward's Island Bridge up until 2017. And then suddenly in 2018, Ward's Island disappeared, and now it's the 103rd Street Bridge. In its own map, the Reynolds Island Park Alliance de-emphasizes the institutions. They're kind of grayed out, and it doesn't use the Ward's Island name. So it's kind of grays out the institutions, just like the wastewater treatment facility. So some of the questions I had with the book that I wanted to answer was like, what do New Yorkers know about the island? And then what do people who live on it want New Yorkers to know? So I did an online survey of general New York City residents by the crowdsourcing platform Prolific in late 2022. And by and large, a very small number of New Yorkers really knew what Ward's Island was. And those who thought that they knew largely didn't know that it currently housed institutions. So these are just some examples of responses. There used to be a psychiatric facility. Is this the island that once held a hospital for smallpox? Sounds like one of those islands that used to be a hospital. I think there are old buildings that are no longer in use. Sounds like it has a prison facility on it. And we also did surveys of residents. We did this via outreach, at the bus stop and in other public locations. And we asked people, questions about what it was like living there. But we also said, what would you like New Yorkers who are unfamiliar with it to know about Ward's Island and what it's like to live on it? And so one of our participants said, bluntly, the goddamn truth. We are New York's forgotten people, discarded, not treated like people. Another resident and indicated that they were aware that they were not welcome in some of the parkland areas. He says, we don't go over there because of our label, not because we'll start a fight. It's protected. This place is separate from the bicycle place. And other people just talked about the isolation, that you had to wait for the bus just to go to the store. There are no stores. But there were also people who talked about the peace and calm that it brought. So they said it's a special place. It was a good space for your mind. So those are also important to consider. We also asked staff, former staff specifically, about their experiences with working on the island, and they kind of echoed this sense of isolation. So one person said, felt like a very, very different from being in another part of the city. It seemed separated and isolated from the rest of Manhattan. Another person also said very isolated. And another person talked about this disjoint between the recreation, of Randall's Island and the isolation, institutional isolation of Ward's Island. So they're referencing this music festival, the Electric Zoo, which happened until last year, and the party going on, and then the patients being there at the same time, and kind of this real bizarre kind of juxtaposition. So what will the future bring? I do talk about this a little in the book and give some different perspectives. So one vision is that's endorsed by the Randall's Island Park Alliance, which is that there must be relocation of certain agency on the island. And Karen Cohen, who founded the Randall's Island Park Alliance said, my goal is to tear the buildings down, even if we don't have money to do more than that. Another vision comes from Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine. These are screenshots from Instagram saying, what if a key to solving New York's mental health crisis was hiding in plain sight? And those are photos of Ward's Island. So the vision is to increase the census of Manhattan Psychiatric Center, uh, more than double it, and that this would be a way to bring people off the street and into a safe treatment location. I think that this is off the mark for a number of reasons. I talk about it in the book, and this is a blog post that I put out where I talk about it specifically. And my proposal is that we use the land on Ward's Island to build permanent housing that can get people out of shelters, and also bring amenities to those who live there to make it a sustainable place to live, and not one where you're essentially in exile. Some other things I want to note. So the island is zoned for residential, part of the island is zoned for residential use. So this is a big chunk here. That's R6 zoning, which is medium density zoning that much of the city is set at. So there would really be a lot of opportunity to create this and not lose any of this parkland. There are good calls for improving the transportation access that I think are appropriate. And so this is one from an organization called randallsislandtransit.org that calls for improving bus access. So right now we just have this one line from East Harlem, and we could have access coming from Queens and from the Bronx. Another slightly more grandiose vision comes from the Regional Planning Association. It's the proposal for a train line called the Triborough, which would go over the Amtrak train line and include a stop on Ward's Island. So that would be really wonderful, especially if there was an increase in the residential number of people who live there. That would really facilitate life there. I also propose the creation of a museum of mental health, which New York City does not have. In the Keener building, this is the Keener building, currently one of the shelters. It's a grand old building that I think would be a great location for a museum. I take my inspiration from my colleagues at the National Museum of Mental Health Project, who are trying to advance this. And some components that my colleague Paul Pifko has talked about in terms of best practice components of mental health museums are experiential, historic, and cultural. So on the left here is a photo from the Mental Health Mind Matters exhibit, which is an experiential exhibit that is circulating around the United States. And these are destigmatization focused exhibits. In terms of cultural, I mean, in terms of historic, there's nothing currently on the island that um, pays tribute to those who lived there, died there, and continue to experience, this isolation. So this is just a photo from in Toronto, Canada. There's a wonderful area called the Center for Addiction and Mental Health that's built on the former campus of the Asylum of Toronto. And you can see here that it has a plaque where it shows how the wall that surrounded it was built by patient laborers, and it pays tribute to that. And you know that's the type of thing that we're really lacking here. And then cultural or art exhibits are other things that are a best practice component, and there's lots of opportunity for that. There's wonderful art created by people. If you've ever been to the Fountain House Gallery, you've seen some of that excellent art, and this could be another exhibition space for it that could be permanent. So I'm interested in your thoughts and experiences. I'm interested in hearing what people have to say in the Q&A. I just want to note, if you're interested in the book, it's available for physical purchase at a few independent bookstores. I know this from the websites. They say that they have a couple copies, mostly in Manhattan. Doesn't seem to be carried much in Brooklyn or other boroughs. And it's also available for order through the publisher and the other online outlets whose names I won't say. So that's my presentation, and I'm happy now to hear Peter's thoughts and your thoughts.
Thank you, Philip. That was great. It is certainly an important book. I'm very glad that we could be hosting the conversation. I want to remind everybody before I start posing questions to send in questions of your own with the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. I'm just going to mix those in with the questions that we have prepared for our guest. Uh, Philip, maybe before I jump into some of those, we should talk about a question that came in from Linda Gustafson, who wrote, "What do you mean exactly by warehousing?" That word does a lot of carries a lot of weight in your title and argument. So maybe you want to spell that out just as kind of some context for going forward.
Sure. So that word was chosen by the publisher, and with my agreement, of course, because the original thing that I wanted to talk about was use the term institutional dumping,
Yeah.
was seen to be not like the best way to frame it, because if you Google institutional dumping, you'll see something about stocks and things like that. That was initially what I wanted to be discussing, because it has been a place where institutions that are seen as unwanted, or at risk of causing community opposition could be put, to just steer clear of that, right? So, yeah, warehousing means like putting people there without offering them opportunity to, uh, live in the community in any other way, right? So again, if you have somebody living somewhere where there are no services, they are not really in the community.
Yeah, yeah. And this isn't a question that I'd prepared, but as you were talking about the 60s and that moment that historians at least refer to as deinstitutionalization, when,
Hmm.
I mean, New York had a very, very large, a lot of states. I remember researching, this was a part of the book that I wrapped up uh, recently. Going into this story a bit, just being kind of shocked at how many people were in these institutions, and of course the whole sort of promise and at least for some people, a sincere belief was that these new drugs, miracle drugs, would sort of be a way to save costs for state governments that were often strapped to a surprising degree in the post-war years, and that the law that sort of brought that about had promised that they would be setting up clinics where that's what would be distributed. How much of that is about, so how much of that kind of informs the larger problem we're talking about? I mean, we're talking about something that happened now over 50 years ago, but it seems like when we're talking about warehousing, it's also kind of about this, just this larger lack of infrastructure we have in the US.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And so I try to get into that a bit because the whole story of homelessness intersects with that and like kind of what happened.
Yeah.
And what I present in the book is that there are two sides to the story. When it really came to a head in 1980, there was the city side and the state side, right? And so the city side was you, the state, are letting people out of the hospital without follow up, right? And the state side was you, the city, have destroyed through incentives tens of thousands of units of low cost housing, specifically SROs, single
Yeah.
room occupancy hotels that people lived in, right?
Mm.
Single adult, these were the places where single adults would live, whether they were immigrant men or people who were coming out of incarceration or a hospital. And so the city was there was this massive decrease in the number of those, and that coincided with deinstitutionalization. But there was a lag, right? So homelessness didn't really start to come to a head until 77, 78. Um, and deinstitutionalization started in the early 60s and really peaked in like 73, right? So it didn't kind of fit exactly the city's story, which was that people were released. What it really kind of seemed to be more was that people were released, they had places, they lost them, and then they were winding up at the Bowery shelter, and there wasn't enough space. So it's a complicated story. And New York was kind of the canary in the coal mine because this ended up happening all around the country, but it came to a head first here, and a big part of it, of course, deinstitutionalization happened all around the country, but we also had hypergentrification first, and that also was a big part of it.
And just for sake of clarity, before anybody asks questions about this, uh, there was a big debate in the 80s about, or at least there was some debate about what was the sort of main driver for this. And there were some folks who wanted to kind of foreground the question of the mentally ill and maybe
Hmm.
talking about,
Yeah.
my understanding is that's actually not the lion's share of folks who are homeless. Or is that do you differ with that
Yeah.
take or?
No, it's not. And I mean, it's not even the lion's share of people, the single homeless population, single adult pop, which is where most of those folks would be now, right? The biggest proportion of the homeless are families now, right? In New York and elsewhere. So, but yeah, it's a disproportionate share, right? A third, let's say, that's the best estimate.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, Larger than the population, general population, about 5% have a serious mental illness. So 30% of the homeless is it's definitely disproportionate, but it is not one and the same.
No. All right, so I'm going to jump into some of my questions and your questions.
Sure.
We kind of jumped forward a little bit, but maybe
Mm-hmm.
rewind a bit and talk about the origins of the book. So
Mm-hmm.
you referenced growing up on Wars Island.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, Folks wanted to know as you were speaking, you talked a little bit about it, but I'm wondering, how did it impact your decision to write this book? You kind of described a rather bucolic kind of pleasant upbringing, but obviously
Yeah.
it has some impact on that
Mm-hmm.
in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. One part of it was that people always asked me what it was like, right? And I sort of felt like, okay, this is something that people are interested in. Um, the other what is that because I was seeing kind of in real time, I was seeing this erasure of it. I sort of felt like a duty to document its existence, right? And so with erasure of its current existence is erasure of its past and the people who've been on it and are still on it. So I felt like that was a duty I had. And very few people who had the same experience I had. So I was kind of one of a handful who could do it. And since I'm in this field, I sort of felt like I'm the one to do it. It definitely impacted me because I understand what it's like to be isolated, right? So yeah, my dad had a car. He could go back and forth, but I didn't. So I had that same kind of sense of isolation
Yeah.
that many people who live there have, but I also had that sense of sanctuary. And I think that that's valuable. And it's something that I also felt very keenly how that is lost with the fencing, right? And so in the book, I talk about when I went back, in 2013, and I wanted to go up to the water, and I couldn't. The fence was there, and I was like, there's something wrong about this."
Yeah. You said you quote folks in the book who say
Mm-hmm.
it's more like a jail.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously your own research had an impact on the analysis and the suggestions you lay out at the end.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily think that I was going to be recommending that there be permanent housing placed on the island, but some of the responses that I got kind of made me open up to that idea. And then when I asked the former staff about it, people seemed very receptive to it as well. And then looking at the zoning and sort of seeing this is possible, we have a shortage of affordable housing in New York. Why can't this be a possibility?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I'm going to tack over to another question from an audience member. Melinda Griner asks, what's the criterion for keeping 150 people, for example, in the hospital? And what happens, what do you think will happen to the building eventually, since most of it seems empty?
Well, state hospitals still have a role. You're transferred to a state hospital from a general hospital if you're not improving in the amount of time that they can offer. And usually that's no longer than a month, right? But the typical length of stay in your general hospital unit is about 2 weeks. So there's a subset of people who don't respond in that short amount of time. It's a relatively small group, and they might get put on a list to be transferred to a state hospital. So if you're in Manhattan, Manhattan Psychiatric Center would be the state hospital of choice. Um, Once you're in, you don't leave for roughly 9 months. The length of stay is quite long. So why does it take that long? Partly it has to do with the fact that they can't discharge you until you have housing. Like it's illegal to do that. So that creates all kinds of complications. There's also this long stay group that's there for years. I don't know a lot about that group and their characteristics, but in the state's data, they present that there's kind of like these two groups. There's the group that gets out in 9 months, and there's the long stay group. Um, so what's going to happen to the buildings? Well, I argue that we could consolidate and we could have everybody in the two hospitals in one building. They were built to accommodate 1,000 each. So the Kirby could accommodate the 200 folks plus the 150 who are in Manhattan State Hospital together. And then those two large buildings could be demolished and could make space for permanent housing.
And just to give us a sense of uh, forest and trees here, Lenora Flint Monrovia asks, what's the ratio of patients to residents on the island? Do you have a sense for that? It's mostly not residents.
Well, okay, so patients to residents. So they're those 350 inpatients, right? And
Yeah,
then the rest of the people who live there are in the shelters, in the community residences, and in Odyssey House. So the majority are not inpatient.
yeah,
Um, Other residents, there are none,
or
right?
none.
So
Yeah, has to be.
my family, we were a handful.
Yeah,
We left in 1980. One other family that we knew left a few years after that. So there are no other there are no non-institutional residents on the island.
Yeah. Um, uh, so uh, you referenced in the talk some concern about the way in which Ward's Island has kind of disappeared among the sense of public's awareness. I mean, some of the questions we got from folks are, talking about whether it's been sort of confused with Blackwells, what used to be called Blackwells, and other islands that were used for similar purposes. Uh, that's Do you want to say more about I mean, was that sort of a major reason for the book? The sense it sort of just adds to the whole sense of invisibility, right? I mean, physically rendered invisible in many ways, and then disappears from public imagination, which just kind of adds to the whole sense of isolation.
Yeah, so I don't have evidence for the motivation behind the removal of the name. Um, I have hypotheses that are based around this idea of kind of branding or rebranding of areas to remove associations. So, as New Yorkers, we know that neighborhoods are often rebranded, right? And so, I live in Washington Heights. There's an area that some people wanted to call Hudson Heights. There's kind of a very strong, viscerally negative response to that from longtime residents because it's seen kind of as like an erasure of the history. Wanting to do that to differentiate yourself from, a neighborhood that had associations of drugs and crime, right? Um, so that's a thing. We know that that's a thing. So I'm hypothesizing that it's related to that, but I don't know. I don't have any source that can confirm that. What I can say is that it is gradually being used less and less. Currently, it's on the bus. MTA has it. Manhattan Psychiatric Center calls itself, says it's located on Wards Island. Other institutions, the Odyssey House, it says it's on Wards Island. The wastewater treatment facility says Wards Island. So those things still carrying on the name, but in terms of maps and other things, descriptions, it's being phased out in a sense. I don't personally feel that the name has to be used, but what I feel like has to be maintained is the history and the awareness that it's not just a park, but this is a place that people live. And what I saw with the survey I did of New Yorkers is that they don't have that. They don't know that.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, I mean, you sort of gesture at this in your talk, but I mean, one way, and this comes in from some of the comments, one way in which to sort of reverse that erasure would be having better transportation to it, right?
Sure. Well, it would definitely help those who live there, and it would also help other people get to it. But perhaps we can have, more. Um, I mean, having, acknowledging history would be one way, but this isn't just history. This is present.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so another question about population. How many of these folks that are there for mental health reasons are there involuntarily?
Well, everybody who's in the state hospital is there involuntarily, but there are other forms of in lack of voluntariness in terms of being in a shelter or being in a community residence where um, you're there because you don't have any other option, right? Um, but yeah, so it's really only the 350 who are in the hospitals, but you could argue that everybody there is there because there's no other option. And those are some of the kinds of things that people said when we talked to them.
And we have a question from Edward about the inpatient population. Do you have a sense for what that was at its height for
Yeah,
Manhattan?
8,000 was the high water mark, and I saw that clearly from the year to year um, annual reports. It started to change after 1930 because there was anticipation of the removal of everybody from the island because of the laws of 1933 that I mentioned. So people started to be transferred to other places. Uh, one of the reasons why they couldn't bring it down completely was because a large number of patients at that time were elderly people who were being housed there for um, conditions that we wouldn't think of as reasons for someone to be in a state hospital now, dementias and post stroke, conditions and stuff like that. They were very difficult to send to far off hospitals to transport. So it didn't get below 3,000 in those days.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let me tie back to some of the questions I
Hmm.
had. So, question about the process. Was it difficult getting source material for this book, or how did that go?
Yeah, well, so I want to acknowledge that I'm not a historian, and I had to learn how to, go to original sources for it. And the first important source was the annual reports, which went back to 1873, and went as far as 1961, and then ran out. Then they disappeared from the public record, unfortunately, after 1961. But that gave a real great source of information on the New York City Asylum for the Insane turning into Manhattan State Hospital.
Did you get any sense for why they disappear? Sorry to interrupt, but
I was told I did a FOIA request. I was told that it would be a Herculean effort to recover them. They were somewhere in storage, and
okay, so they're classified in warehouse somewhere.
I don't know if classified. I don't know why. Everything else was in the public library, but yeah. So that's what I was told. I did try to get a hold of them. Um, so that was one source of information. Other archival sources were important. There's the Alexander McDonald archive at the New York Academy of Medicine. So he was that first long-term superintendent. His whole personal archive is there, letters, everything. Um, there's the Robert Moses archive at the New York Public Library, which, it's vast, but there were specific sections that referred to this sort of chapter
Hmm.
in his work. And there's also a lot of interesting stuff at the New York City Municipal Archive, down by City Hall, and there were some things in the State Archive in Albany, but not a lot more than what I was able to find in the city. New York Academy of Medicine, no, I'm sorry, New York Historical Society had things that were more related to the very early history of the island. When it was first settled, and some of the records around the immigrant refuge and hospital.
Um, and then going back to the homelessness question,
Hmm.
the book discusses quite a bit the homelessness epidemic of the late 70s, early 80s, the city versus state dynamic. We talked a little bit about that before. Uh, you make the case for saying the state perspective needs to be brought into understanding. Was there any more than what you had sort of said earlier you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, just basically that it's gotten lost in the narrative of deinstitutionalization being the driver of homelessness, and and that's impactful because it speaks to what solutions are proposed, right?
Of course.
And so if the narrative is that it's because of deinstitutionalization, well, then the solution is proposed is like that the president of the United States proposes, which is build institutions for people who are sickos, right? That's his policy proposal. And so, the other side is permanent housing, subsidized permanent housing needs to be available, right? So
Yeah.
one fact that I think people often leave off is that it is not possible to afford market rate housing if you're receiving SSI. SSI is the income source of most people with serious mental illnesses in the United States. Uh, it's roughly about $1,000 a month now. Recently was increased. Not possible to afford market rate housing with that. Subsidized housing is necessary. And uh, it is a proven solution. Single adult homelessness decreased every time there was a New York agreement passed, and new units were created. But it's temporary. We need to keep creating new units because people move into them, and then new people become homelessness and have that need. So um, there needs to be expanded investment in that.
Yeah. Um, um, you'll forgive me for not being optimistic right now, but the argument doesn't go away for not being popular. Um, Paul Sheridan Belfast writes on this point. He wonders if Randall Island could be a model for permanent housing and real amenities. Although, of course, that experiment took over 30 years and is now,
Roosevelt Island.
yeah,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
has its own problems, obviously.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I talk about that in the last chapter. Yes, it took a long time, but it did happen. It did succeed. I actually lived there as well with my family. That was where we moved after we lived on Wars Island. Lived there for 4 years. Um, yeah, the Roosevelt Island experiment included a lot of low-income housing, uh, and I think that that can be one model for this. It's sort of a different time in New York when there wasn't as much of a focus on development for massive profit. So the focus wasn't on luxury housing per se when it started. And there was also this idea that like we're going to build a community, we need a school, we need amenities, right? Um, they were pretty minimal when I lived there in the early '80s, but it was enough. And the tramway was built, so there would be transportation source. Now there's a subway stop.
I mean, when you were laying out your vision for what would happen if care for the marginalized were a priority for legislators, I was thinking about some of the things I've just kind of picked up over the years, reading or talking to people about these communities that exist in the U.S. where I don't know if these were self-organized but I was literally just the other day, someone was telling me about this community out west where folks who have this specific sort of hearing disability created a community. There's similar communities I understand for people with other impairments. Are there models out there like that beyond New York that kind of speak to you?
What I'm thinking of is like what's called, I think it's called Heel is how you say it in Flemish, which is kind of like this town in present day Belgium that
Mm.
uh, was always like a place that people with mental illness and their families would come to because there was a shrine of Saint Dymphna that people would came to seek absolution and healing from. And it became kind of this place that just sort of welcomed people with mental illness because it sort of boosted the economy, I guess.
Yeah,
Um, and so that's kind of one idea.
that there is always a priority for.
Hmm. Yeah, and so I guess the other thing that I sort of wanted to emphasize in what I talked about in the last chapter is like, yeah, with these businesses, they could, yes, these would be businesses, hopefully at, um, subsidized or you know preferable rents, right?
Yeah.
But they would serve the general community, and hopefully they would hire residents of the island, and that kind of fits in with this Italian social model of like so in Italy, um, state hospitals were closed. Leo Basaglia was this reformer who championed that, and they've been closed since then. And so what they have is this social enterprise model where uh, people work in businesses and people in the community know they're coming somewhere, and it's staffed by people with disabilities or people with mental illnesses, and that can in itself can be sort of like obviously it's a work opportunity that's great for people to have, but it's also an opportunity to like reduce stigma as you're interacting with people in this functional role as a helper rather than as somebody who is kind of not able to offer anything because of their status in society. So I see opportunity for that, especially if we had the museum as well. Then that would make it kind of that kind of experience. So I see opportunity for that.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious about that. Uh, how much of that is a function of social organization, and how much of that is kind of downstream from a general, you know, it's not a secret that the Western European countries anyway spend a lot more money goes back to citizens as opposed to contractors or
Mm-hmm.
main
Mm-hmm.
beneficiaries here. Um, is that, I mean, from the question of how this would be done, how was that done there? Is this about sort of communities that just have more to sort of like local governments that have more to sort of dispense in that front, or what, how did those institutions or towns sort of the market the
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to say how I don't know much about how Italy funds it, but I know when I was there last year and I talked to colleagues and they said that it's there's no interest in returning to you know a time where there would be state hospitalization. I think that a big part of it in a country like Italy is that family support is kind of built in culturally.
yeah
So people do largely stay with their families, and there's less of this sense of kind of the state taking over sort of responsibility than there is here. Um, and yeah, in terms of public investment in mental health services, yes, it's more generous in Western Europe, but I think that it's also reflects like a general community commitment to making this work. Um, and I also think that in the United States we have a big problem with scapegoating people with mental illness for various social ills, and perhaps there's less of that in some of those countries.
yeah. So, I mean, in thinking, taking a step back and thinking about this book and your thoughts on this project, at this point, is that sort of the lesson you take away? How would you kind of the history, current status of Wars Island? What does it teach us about New York, or what does it teach us about the U.S. more generally?
Yeah, yeah. So to me, I see it kind of like sitting at an important position, related to a lot of themes of kind of New York history. So, New York is a place of commerce, from the beginning, right? And it's also a place of immigration, right? So we're sort of like the profit, motive, and there's the diversity, side. But that also means that there's kind of like this greed, you know, driver to a lot of what happens, and there's also fear of the other because we're constantly getting new groups coming in, right? So I think that it kind of reflects those two things, kind of maybe sort of the darker sides of New York City, the greed and fear, right? So people are located there because of fear of the other, so that they can be kept away, and then developing things into parkland, kind of finding things that someone else thinks that they have, and saying, no, I'm going to take that, whether it's waterfront, all kinds of areas that get gentrified, that's part of that kind of greed, real estate market driving kind of thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
there's also public beautification in the March of Progress. And, Moses kind of sits in that narrative with, kind of this confidence in that, well, whatever we're doing is for the best, right? And so if you read The Power Broker, he said, like, whoever's on the side of parks is on the side of angels, right? And so that was one of the things that he would always say. But Moses also believed in building a lot of roads and, prioritizing cars
yeah,
for public transportation. So, the March of Progress brings good things, and it also brings some things that are maybe in retrospect we're like don't see as being as good. So those are some important, parts of the New York story that I think this exemplifies. I also think it's kind of like a part of the New York story of people who are sort of left out of the bigger story, right? Which is, yes, we talk about immigrants, but we don't often talk about immigrants who've been diagnosed with mental illnesses, and just like the fact that um, the way that immigrants who were considered to be insane upon arrival were treated was that they would be immediately shipped back, right? And there was this you know sense of like, oh, we have to keep the person until they're doing well enough to be shipped back. So that's kind of also part of this reluctance to accept that this is part of life,
Yeah.
and we
Okay.
can't just screen people out of the United States, based on these types of things. And that coming to the United States causes, reactions that can then turn into insanity, right? And we have a lot of data for that. Immigrants are at increased risk, in all countries of developing psychosis and other mental health conditions. So, that's another thing. The way people are treated, the sense of exclusion that they experience, impacts them as well.
Um, Very interesting. Not surprising, I guess. Uh, okay, so in terms of uh, goals, I mean, do you want to say any more about what you're hoping to accomplish with the book? There's rich history in here on a as I gestured to in the introduction. This is a corner of the of New York City's history that just doesn't get the attention that it deserves. What do you hope you might achieve with the publication of the book? Um, and what do you think maybe some folks that are listening, what could they do to sort of help realize some of the, or at least get the conversation started about some of the solutions that you proposed?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't, have too many illusions about, policymakers, paying attention to this, but I sort of felt like it was worth a try.
Yeah.
And at the very least, I'm putting something into the public record that endorses the existence of folks who have lived there and live there now. Um, and maybe it's bringing them some sense of validation. I've talked to some people who've voiced that, so that's something that I'm happy to provide from the privileged position that I have as an academic. And I talk about it in the book. I am one of the most privileged residents of the island, right? So I feel like that comes with some responsibility. Um, So, yeah, I mean, if it were able to impact some of this discussion and someone who might have some influence would say, "Hey, let's consider this," I that'd be wonderful. I'm not uh, gonna claim that I have every detail worked out in terms of how we would make this happen, but hopefully it would be a starting point for policymakers to take further, because we do have a crisis of space for affordable housing, and this is an opportunity. And yeah, and just acknowledging that you know life is is different, when you're in a place that you can only get to buy a bag of chips, by taking a bus that you have to wait 20 to 30 minutes for. That's a different kind of life. That's a different kind of New York existence than what the rest of us um, experience and value. And of course, 125th and Lexington has a whole host of issues that have been widely discussed, in terms of drug dealing. And a lot of it has to do with this kind of reaction to, like, people coming off the bus and being seen as kind of easy targets for that. That's another thing that, you know, a lot of people like to talk about and complain about, but, maybe another option would be to provide other places for people to go to get basic needs.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that I think we could start to talk about with this. And so maybe somebody in the larger media would pick it up, and maybe somebody in a position of policy influence would pick it up. But that would be kind of things that would be at the highest level of success for it.
Mary is asking if uh, flood zone issues are a question here. Is that one way in which the sort of macro living planning might be brought to bear on the future of the island?
Not to my knowledge. When Superstorm Sandy happened, I don't know if there being pronounced flooding there. So yeah, it might just be that residential settings are recessed enough. But yeah, of course that's always a consideration when you're building near the water. Um, but yeah, that's something that there are others who have um, better knowledge of that to speak to. But that's my sense is that's not what's getting in the way of this type of development. It has more
No,
to do
no, no.
with
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
the sense that like this would be detracting from the potential of converting it all to parkland.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, Philip, I want to say thank you for writing this book. Uh, even when we do talk about the marginalized, we're often not talking about some of the people you're talking about here. We don't, I mean, I'm just reading a quote here from one of our viewers who asks, have we really come that far at all in the way that we manage folks with mental illness? Those of us who know people who struggle with that ask that question all the time. Um, Several other folks who were echoing my appreciation for the work you're doing here, and especially around disability and carceralism. If folks want to contact you, your email is on your John Jay profile, correct?
Yeah, I can put in the chat too. Anybody who so I can click message everybody, right? So I'll
Yes.
put that in there. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I'll
I'm
just
happy
and
to respond to emails. And
and
yeah,
I'll
if
just
somebody's having trouble finding the book, I can, direct them
and anyone can
to
write
Randall.
to us too at the Gotham Center. We'd be happy
Hmm.
to refer you. I'm going to end with a question from Stacy Horn, our mutual friend,
Yeah, yeah.
who wrote a fantastic book, as you mentioned earlier, Damnation Island, which I recommend you all read after you've, or at the same time that you go to
Read that
purchase
first. And
Philip's
then
book.
yeah.
Um, uh, she asks, she writes, what happened on Wars Island was going on nationwide, I read and loved your book. I would love to read a book that gives an overview of the rest of the country. So
Mm.
what are you working on next? I think she would write that book.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was something that I was thinking about doing when I started. It was like, oh, it wouldn't just be about this; it would be about similar places in other locations, right?
Yeah,
Not just in the U.S., other places as well. Like I attended a conference presentation by a colleague from Israel who showed this map of how he worked in a hospital, and it was like next to a shooting range, and it was next to a cemetery, and then like a
right.
dump. Yeah, it was basically like ringed by by these kinds of things. Um, but I do want to also say, yeah, yes, there are putting people in far off locations happened everywhere, but um, as far as I know, we're the only ones who still have an island, that is just for that purpose, right? You may have recently heard that President Trump recommended that we reopen Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay. So that's the type of thing that we might be, moving toward if that were the idea. But we don't really do that anymore in other places. But we're still doing it in New York. And yeah, we have Rikers, which is there are moves to close it. Um, but this kind of multi-use institutional island is really kind of unique to New York, and that's like you mentioned, New York is an archipelago, so that gives us opportunity. But New York is also a very densely populated place, and these islands have been seen as an opportunity. In other places they were just pushed to the fringe. This way,
Yeah.
people could be kind of kept close in a way at the same time. So it's kind of an unique New York thing, and that was sort of what led me to decide to just stick with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a great book. I recommend everyone go out and read it. I want to thank you for joining us and sharing your research with us. Yeah, I hope that you do consider that other book. We would be very happy to have you back and talk about it.
Okay, maybe in a few years. Well, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. And yeah, this is a book for New York people, people who eat, sleep, drink, everything, breathe New York. So if you're that's what you're into, then I hope that you'll find it to be useful along with other books that fit into that category.
Excellent. Comes recommended. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We will see you again in the fall. We have a jam-packed and very exciting calendar of events, if I say so myself. And we will be busy with a ream of other exciting projects this summer that we'll be telling you about next year. So signing off for now. See you again soon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.